Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Q&A about business, innovation, and managing life. And I see a bunch of questions saved up here. Let's see. One from Laurie here. How would you think about approaching a business from a science and research background versus an entrepreneur? Well, it's first thing is what's the kind of business going to be? In other words, if it was the case that everybody who started a business had started a business before, no business would ever be started. So there has to be a moment where you go from being not an entrepreneur to being an entrepreneur, so to speak. I would say that in my first statement about starting businesses, if you're kind of oriented towards science and research and so on, is try and make a product that you actually want. If it's like, well, I figured out these things and I think there'll be people over here who want this thing, but I don't actually want it myself, that's not a very good place to start. It's much better if the thing you're making can be something that you're really interested in, that you would want yourself, and so on. In terms of kind of how do you set up having a product happen, having a company happen, and so on, the thing to realize is if you're doing science and research and you're doing it kind of where you're the leader and you are driving it, the process of making a thing happen in science and research is not that different from the process of making a thing happen in the kind of entrepreneurial sector. It's the detailed content might be different, the detailed kind of what you deliver in the end might be different, but the kind of, the make the thing happen part is not so different. Now, there are also plenty of people who do science and research who are, oh, I'm part of some group and there's some principal investigator somewhere and they're really driving the strategy and I'm just doing some little piece of it. Then you won't have had that experience. You might still be able to do the big entrepreneurial thing, but you won't have immediately had that experience. I think the thing that another general comment is that somehow people who are quite analytical, they understand how to figure things out, somehow when they're confronted with sort of entrepreneurial business commercial type questions, they sort of freeze and they don't think they can apply the type of thinking that they've had that they've been using in science and research to those other things. I think sort of keeping the thinking apparatus engaged is a critical element of being able to do things in any area. But if you've been successful at having the thinking apparatus engaged in science and research, that should give you a model for engaging it on entrepreneurial kinds of things, as opposed to like, well, okay, it works there, but entrepreneurialism is different. So therefore, I can't sort of engage my thinking apparatus. That would be a mistake. And I think that's one of the sort of challenges to be able to do that. I would say that one feature of doing kind of research where you're kind of the driver of that research is you're going from nothing to something, which is the same kind of thing that you're doing in an entrepreneurial activity. It's like you got to make everything up. There's nothing there. You're going to make up what's going to happen, and you're going to create something from nothing, so to speak. So a few comments there. Let's see. Elsie asks, do you ever analyze your organization and its projects from the perspective of its bottlenecks and tackling those deliberately? Not in a very organized way. I mean, it is the case that as one gets a feeling projects are getting stuck. What's happening? Let's figure out a way to unstick these projects. Like, for example, projects are getting stuck because the projects really require multiple groups to collaborate and there's no mechanism for collaboration. So you put in place kind of a project management mechanism and so on. I mean, there are specific cases where you can see this is a reason things are getting stuck. I think I would say probably that is a number one reason why things get stuck. There are silos, they get constructed, there are groups, they do their thing, but then something comes along that requires one to bridge between those different groups, and you don't have the right mechanisms to do that. You may not have the right structural mechanisms, you may not have the right almost social, cultural, expectational mechanisms to do that. It's kind of like, well, we're a group that just does what we do. We don't like get input from the outside about what we should do and so on. A few thoughts about that. let's see. The horse asks, do you ever delay some important decisions? Yes. And here's the usual reason why. I feel like I know I'm going to have more information and it's and I should just wait. I mean, there are things where, for example, in developing and releasing products and so on, some of the time it's like, well, we should decide this and that and the other. We should decide how much it should cost. We should decide how we should present it to this and that and the other. We should decide that. Oh, it's going to be 6 months before we release the product. We don't even really know what the product is. Much better to leave that stuff till almost the last minute. It's a big kind of fire drill hustle to get all that stuff together, but then you know what you have. And making a decision at a point where it's like, well, in the future this might happen. It's, to me, what I've learned, at least for myself, is that it's much better to get into a situation where, yes, it may be urgent, you may have to really nail it right then, there are deadlines, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Much better to have all the information, but for it to be urgent, than to try and make a decision way in advance. You don't have the information, the decision will likely has a much lower probability of being right. In fact, it may cause you trouble because having thought you made that decision, you may be taking a path based on that decision that you wouldn't have taken if you just hadn't known what the decision was. You would have kept various options open, and that would have been the right thing to do. So I think that's a reason to do that. Now, in terms of sort of, oh, I'm not in the right mood to make this decision, that isn't usually my point of view. I mean, sometimes it's like, well, I think I should do this, but let's let it rattle around for a few days, and let's see how we feel about that decision or that direction later on. I mean, a classic example of this kind of thing is when you're trying to name products. And you say, well, what's it going to be? And you have some meeting and you're discussing it. You come up with some name, and then you get to the end of the meeting and nobody can even remember the name that the group came up with during that meeting. That's sort of a really bad sign. That's a sign where if you'd said, okay, we got the name, let's go, register the domains, send everything out based on, make up the balloons with that name on them right in the middle of that meeting. Then by the end of the meeting, people can't even remember what the name was. That's a very compressed version of this. But sometimes there are things where you make at least for me, you make kind of a proto decision and then you kind of see how it starts to develop. In fact, I would say that's a pretty common thing, that you say, look, this is the way we're planning to do it. Let's go in that direction. This is sort of there's a leadership issue here, because there's a question of, if you're pretty sure that's the right direction, just say, this is what we're going to do. And then sometimes you have the situation of say, I changed my mind. We got to change this. I guess I find most of the time, if one's lucky, one doesn't have to change one's mind. But I think it's not a terrible thing to say, this is the direction we're going in. Let's build everything up on the basis of that direction. And, as we build it up, we might realize, wait a minute, this isn't working. We can't really go in this direction. There's this problem, there's that problem. And then we have to change it. But it's better than kind of not really knowing what direction we're going in. And people are, it's hard for people to engage in the project and so on. I mean, I think that's there are definitely times when you develop something, a piece of a product, a feature, this or that or the other, and you get to a point where you look at it and you say, wait a minute, we went in the wrong direction here. And I think it isn't trivial with a team to, explain, look, we went in the wrong direction, let's change to this other direction. It helps a lot if the answer isn't, oh, we built this whole thing up and now it went in the wrong direction, so we're just going to kill it. And all the work you did is wasted. No, it's like, well, we're making a change of direction and we're building on what was done and we're going to make something great. And maybe a little bit of work was wasted, but not much. And the result is going to be much more worthwhile. I mean, I think in our particular company, we have the feature that we essentially never kill projects. I mean, this was just a bad idea, throw away everything we did on it. partly because we don't start projects where that's going to happen, but also there are times when projects have just been too expensive in one way or another, and we just don't think the market cares. We don't think that it's the right time. We don't have quite the right resources to finish it. And we hibernate these projects. And sometimes we hibernate them for many years. But I think it's been a good kind of vibe for the company that over the nearly, 39 years or something we've been around, the projects have gotten hibernated, but they do come back to life again. They're not dead forever. It's not like the work that was put into them is wasted. It's just, it isn't something that comes out right now, even though, to people who've been working on a project, it's very satisfying when the project really comes out right then, and they can kind of see the results. But it's at least not, it can happen in many companies and organizations that projects, people put lots of effort into them, and the project is just killed. And that's a very demoralizing thing for people, and to think that the work they've done is just thrown away. And I know that in the rare cases where that happens to me for one reason or another on something that's going on, I get all upset about that. I'm like, look, I have only a limited amount of time to do productive work. It's terrible to be doing it on something which is just going to be thrown away. And even if I felt like, look, we're putting this aside right now, but it'll be back in 2 years, 5 years, whatever, I'd feel much better about it than, look, it's just being thrown away and whatever effort I put into it is completely wasted. Elsie asks, how do you manage to context switch between meetings and focused deep work sessions? I've become better at that over the years. Practice helps. I think I will say that it really helps me to know when a meeting is going to be particularly a sort of creative writing meeting and when it's going to be mostly a talking review discussion meeting. I don't know why, but somehow if I know I'm going to be sort of doing writing where it's, where I'm the driver and every word is on me type thing, it helps me to know that's what I'm walking into, and I sort of prepare myself for that. I don't think I do anything terribly active to prepare myself for that. But when it turns out that something that I thought was just a sit and talk meeting turns into, oh, now I actually have to write a bunch of stuff, that's a different pace for me, and it's a difficult thing for me to context switch into that. I found that I guess I happen to have a reasonably good memory. So usually when there's a series of meetings and things, and it's like, okay, we've got the next one in this series of monthly meetings or whatever, as soon as I see the agenda, I can remember a bunch of stuff about what happened the last time. And I usually, it gets me quite quickly into the groove of talking about things the next time, so to speak. But I have to say, I've gotten a lot better at this over the years. I mean, in I don't know, 25 years ago or something, when I wasn't doing as densely packed meetings, it would be kind of I don't know, I'm kind of, there's 5 or 10 minutes of warm up and so on before one just jumps into the meeting. And I have to say, the fact that I usually, doing internal meetings, I'm often, 5 minutes late or whatever, and I kind of, people are already there, maybe they're already talking about something, and I find that it really, I'm just gonna jump right into it, and it's not, and that kind of seems to work quite well. Now, when I'm doing stuff on my own, yes, that's more complicated. I mean, when it's like, okay, I'm going to do some creative work, particularly if I'm going to write something, I'm writing some piece that putting out, and I got to a certain point, and now I have to start again. I have to say, one of the things I've learned for myself about writing is, you write and you get a lot of momentum, and you finish some section of what you're writing, let's say. And then you say, well, let me just go on and write a little bit more. That is not a great thing to do, because for me, the worst case is I've written 3/4 of some section and I've got to sit down and I've got to write the last quarter. That, it takes me, so how do I work with that myself? I usually have to reread what I already wrote. I usually will do something like add links if it's some post that I'm writing or something like this, as a way to kind of engage with the content so that I'm up to speed. And then if I'm lucky, I'm like, by the time I've read through that content, I'm like, oh, that's pretty interesting. Let me go on, and I'm kind of off and running. But generally, I much prefer to be in a situation where I've sort of got okay, I'm going to work on this next section. It's a greenfield thing. I can start from scratch. It's not something where I already wrote a piece of it and then I'm going to have to go back and re-understand that and maybe start again and so on. Let's see. SK asks, how do you best learn science from your experience? Do you learn and internalize the structure, reach a big picture view right away, or do you focus on just gleaning local facts and doing problems? It's an interesting question. I mean, for me, I tend to learn things when I have some question or project that I'm doing that relates to those things. I have a hard time learning in the abstract, so to speak. I mean, it's kind of almost learning for entertainment. I do a little bit of, but I would say most of the time, and I would say when I have an opportunity to learn because I run into a person who knows about something or something like this, then I will take that opportunity. And particularly when it's, talking to the expert in XYZ, I'm sufficiently sort of motivated by doing that I will do my moment of learning things there. But otherwise, when it's just sort of sit and read something, I have to say I'm pretty bad at that. I'm usually, it's like, do I have a particular question I'm trying to answer? Well, then I'll dive in and read lots of stuff to try to understand what's around that question. In terms of what I find, usually I'm driven by some particular question. I will try and find things that fit in with that question. And somehow it's usually what I'll find is sometimes I'll think I have the arc of what's going on figured out. And then I'm trying to sort of fit things into that arc, see whether that arc really works. But sometimes I don't really have an arc figured out. And I'm, for example, doing computer experiments, trying to understand what's going on, looking at trying to get sort of see what has been figured out before and so on. And it's little pieces. And usually what I find is when I'm trying to learn some new field, it's a little bit of a, it's always a humbling experience because it's like I've learned many fields. I'm kind of at some level, I'm totally confident that I can learn some new field. But at some level, when I'm actually into it, it's a different way of thinking. There's a lot of facts I don't know. And it's you kind of have to stay, well, both a little bit confident and a little bit humble. Confident in like, I'm not going to give up, but humble in the sense that there's going to be things I have to learn. And I think that, and it won't be the case that I'll immediately know these things or this way of thinking, particularly in some field. And I would say what usually happens to me is I'll be learning some new field. I'll talk to people who are experts in that field. And then for a while, as I learn it, every expert I talk to will tell me stuff I didn't know. And then there's usually a transition point at which I kind of get it. And usually that fits it in with some bigger intellectual framework that I maybe have thought about for a long time. And then at that point, from that point on, usually the things people tell me, I either already know them or they fit into things that they fit very easily into things that I already know. And it takes effort, it takes real effort to get to the point where you can kind of get your arms around some particular field to be able to understand these things. And I think a thing that is sort of a mistake one can make is to be able to skate too easily. That is, you don't really understand it, but you can kind of respond and you can sort of say, well, I kind of get this point and I can kind of, answer the exercises if you were doing those kinds of things, but you don't really understand it. And I suppose one of the things I think I've become pretty much better at over the years is knowing what it feels like to really understand something, and to be knowing that if I don't really understand it, there'll be things that I can't figure out, and I won't be certain. I'm not sort of on bedrock, being able to build my big skyscraper. I'm still a little bit worried that there might be, I might have sand or mud there instead. And whereas I feel like I've gotten pretty good at getting to the point where I know when I know and I know when I don't know. And so I kind of have some sense of how much is worth me kind of building up, given some level of solidity of the knowledge that I have. I think, I will say that for me, having a project, a question is really critical to driving sort of learning about a particular area. Otherwise, I just, it just doesn't, well, there are areas where I have sort of a meta question that I've often wondered about for decades, and I'll be sort of slowly collecting information, but sort of more or less fitting it in with what that meta question is. And that's helpful to me, at least. Let's see. KD asks, if you could decide how to invest $10 billion for science and technology development, what would you do? Build a bigger particle accelerator, bigger space telescope, artificial superintelligence, what? Interesting question. I remember many, many years ago, this was mid-1980s, I was working at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and I get this message from somebody from DARPA. I forget what it's called, DARPA or ARPA at the time, but the Advanced Research Projects Agency, US government agency, saying, can this person come and see me? Well, in those days, you couldn't look people up on the web because the web didn't exist yet. And so it was like, I don't know who this person is, but yeah, I mean, I've certainly heard of DARPA or ARPA or whatever it was called at the time, and say, sure, yes. So person shows up, and his first question was, if we could spend $10 million on something related to these things called cellular automata that I was studying a lot then, what should we spend it on? And 10 million is probably, the analog today would be 50 or 100 million. And I was like, well, I'm really not sure there's a good thing to spend that kind of money on right now. You could build a big machine that does cellular automata, but I'm not sure that one would know what to do with it. And, my own experiences, even at that time, were that sort of knowing the right experiment and setting it up was much more important than having the sort of brute computation necessary to push it further. So I would say that $10 billion is roughly the cost of a substantial particle accelerator, it's that's a scale of money. It's the cost of doing, it's a bit more than doing current rounds of training, but one could certainly imagine spending that on AI training and so on. Is it a good idea? I don't think so, particularly. I mean, I think that it is something where I wouldn't say I know what direction to go there. I feel like in terms of experiments in science, there is we have an awful lot of experimental data necessary to do fundamental science, both in particle physics, in cosmology, and astrophysics, and so on. We have a bunch of that data. We don't really know what to make of it. My guess is that, for example, our physics project, as we try and push forward to sort of connect that to experimental observations, my guess is the really cool stuff will be, gosh, we can explain this thing that was observed 100 years ago, and now we can explain it, and it's been a mystery all that time. One thing that is always important in these things is keep your experimental data. This happened a few times in particle physics in the 1970s, for example. There had been experiments done in the 1960s, which on particle accelerators, at great expense, where people were then like, well, I just wonder, now there's a new phenomenon that we didn't think of in the 1960s. I wonder whether we actually saw that phenomenon in the 1960s. Oh, well, the bubble chamber film was thrown away. Oh, well. So the experiments had to be redone. So that's kind of a bad thing. If one can avoid that, although the amounts of data generated by many of these experiments are quite large, but if you're spending the $1 billion on getting the data, you might as well store it. And for a time when we know what to do to interpret it, so to speak. I would say that it is funny that when you spend large amounts of money on things, that the money itself causes things to get figured out, having nothing to do with what the money is spent on in some sense. It's kind of like if you say, okay, we're going to spend billions of dollars on particle physics. Okay, then particle physics is a thing. And there are people who are going to support the experiments that are being done with doing theory, and you're going to have this whole ecosystem that's going to support what's going on. And that can cause interesting things to happen, even if the original, let's build a particle accelerator, look at this, doesn't turn out to be all that exciting. But I think it is a challenge for science. I should say, by the way, that there will be a time, I hope, when our physics project makes a bunch of predictions that one has never explored before. And it's like, gosh, we need to do this experiment on a particle accelerator with a space telescope, whatever else. Then I'm going to have a very different answer to this question. Then I'm going to say, okay, I know this thing that's going to cost $3 billion, and it'd be really interesting to do that, which is a different thing from right now, where I feel like we have a lot of data. Now, I mean, there are things which are definitely, we know it's going to be worthwhile. For example, there's lots of scientific data, data about physics, chemistry, whatever else, that one clearly finds useful. But, it's in books of tables and that was measured in the 1930s. Okay, so, an example of something where quite a lot of money could be spent and we know it will be useful is just go measure that stuff automatically. Use robotic labs, just go remeasure all those things and fill in the details, so to speak. Go get that data. That's a thing if one says, well, for sort of out of some economic theory, we want to be spending money right now, making jobs for people in these areas. What should we do? One answer would be go just make all these measurements. Do these things because we have versions of these. They're not very complete. Just go complete them to modern sort of high quality. That's an example of a thing. I don't know how many billions of dollars that would cost. Probably not so many, but it's a thing where I feel like that's sort of a guaranteed it's worth doing. If you say, should you build a bigger particle accelerator? I don't know. It's, as I say, the trickle down of we're going to spend money on a particle accelerator, so that means we should be doing particle physics. That may be worthwhile, but and then we know, we're going to get Higgs particle version 2 type thing discovered in a particle accelerator. I'm not convinced. I mean, there are lots of interesting, cool things that could be done with particle accelerators. One could make a muon collider, for example, where one's colliding muons that normally decay in 2.2 microseconds. But if you get them at relativistic speeds, they can last a lot longer. And they're 206 times the mass of an electron. And you could collide them, and maybe we'd find some substructure in muons and things, and that would be kind of exciting. But I kind of wouldn't mind having a theory that tells us what substructure we'd be expected to find, or we'd imagine finding before going and doing that, because I feel like, it could be the case, as happened with, the specific thing I was referring to earlier was these things called neutral currents, which were a particular type of particle interaction that were not really hypothesized until the 1970s, but had been observed in the 1960s, except nobody really noticed. And then the data was gone by the time people wanted to look for it. So it's an interesting question. I think another issue with science is being big isn't necessarily an advantage. That is, if you think it's important, okay, so there are many different reasons to do science, including just having a group of people in a country, in the world, whatever, who have reached a certain level of proficiency in methods and so on that are used for doing science. That's worthwhile, even independent of the details of what actual scientific research is produced. But that's one thing that makes big science worthwhile. Another thing is there's sort of another theory, which is the bigger the science, the more flowers there are, the more, the more possibility there is that one of them will bloom in an interesting way. That is not necessarily the case, because what happens is the bigger a field gets, the more institutionalized it necessarily gets, and the more that innovation over there is actually much harder to do, because there's a whole field of people who say, well, we've got these funding mechanisms and these review mechanisms and so on, and you're doing something different. Oh, no, the field does this thing. This is what all 50,000 of us do. And if you're doing something different, well, that's alien, that's bad, whatever else. Which is why often fields, when they're in their most active phase, actually don't have that many people in them. And sort of everybody who was in the field was a hero type thing. And, later on, when sort of the history is written type thing, all those 100 people who were doing, quantum mechanics in 1925 or whatever, they're all heroes, or at least most of them, and did something interesting. Whereas by the time it got to be 10,000 people, most of what was done wasn't particularly notable. And as I say, there is a value to just having a lot of people who have a proficiency in these kinds of methods. That has considerable societal and sort of country-wise value. But it's a different thing from being able to figure out, where's the breakthrough, individual breakthrough thing happening. And it is, in fact, it's often counterproductive to have things be bigger. And, I myself have been fortunate in the sense that I've, worked on a bunch of things which in a traditional kind of, oh, I'm a physicist, I'm a this, I'm a that, would have actually been pretty hard to do. Because it's like, well, wait a minute, we can't give you funding for this computational stuff. It's, we're funding physics. That doesn't seem like physics. Well, actually, in the end, it is physics, but that wasn't obvious. And it's not, I have long believed it, and I'm prepared to, risk my own resources on it. And I don't ask people, haven't traditionally asked people to risk their resources on it. So it's one of these things where although now with our Wolfram Institute, we're starting to do that, but I feel like it's a much more secure thing. I don't feel bad sort of taking people's money to move that forward because I know it's going to move forward. It's not something that is in the high risk, high speculative phase, while there's still a lot of great things to be done, a lot of very important things to be done, but it's not, it's a thing where we definitely have a direction, so to speak. Let's see. Oh, by the way, I mean, one of the other branches that KD mentioned here was build the artificial superintelligence. I must say I've been surprised that spending, very large amounts of money on training ends up having, it's had a certain level of, there was a threshold. What will happen from here on out, whether if you spend 10 times as much on the training, you're going to get incredibly much better results, I'm not convinced. There will be areas where that's the case. For example, areas in sort of real world robotics, type things where you have to get data, and it's pretty expensive to get that data. But I think it's something where it's just saying we're going to, people have said for years actually, sort of the Manhattan Project was something which cost, I don't know, what is it, a few $1 billion and I mean, at the time, it was the most expensive kind of science-like project that had ever been done. And it was a thing where an amazing amount was achieved from a science point of view, technology point of view, whatever, in a fairly short time. And people have sort of said, well, again, with the space program, sort of a repeat of that kind of process of achieve a lot in a fairly short amount of time. And people have often wondered, what could we do now that would be like that? Obviously, making moon bases and Mars missions and things a bit like that. But people have said for years, actually, people have said, what about a Manhattan Project for AI? And I've always kind of thought, that doesn't make any sense. We have no idea what to do. You say, okay, let's put $10 billion into it. It's like, okay, what do we do? Day one, what do we actually do? And I mean, in a sense, that experiment got done because, for example, the Japanese fifth generation project in the 1980s was let's put a whole bunch of money into this and make something AI-like. In the end, that project was a lot about kind of raising awareness of Japan as kind of a force in technology development, more so than actually producing technology, I think. And I don't think much technology was produced. But that was a case where money is fed in, what comes out. But I think, the problem is you see these things where it's kind of like lots of money is being put into this. And, somebody like me a little bit rolls my eyes and says, yeah, and what's going to happen with that money? Because nobody really knows what to do. And, managing a project where you have a lot of money and nobody really knows what to do, that's a very difficult thing. I'm not sure, I certainly have ideas about how to do that. It is not a trivial thing to do. It's a thing where much of the time you put all that money in, it'll just get wasted. People will do what they've been doing before, and it will, they'll keep going in the same hamster wheel, so to speak, and nobody will get out of the hamster wheel they were in and start, I don't know what my analogy is, the hamster going and racing down the track or something. but it doesn't tend to happen. People, you put a lot of money in, too much money sometimes, and then it just ends up, people don't know what to do, so they just do what they've been doing before, and nothing really comes out. Anyway, so the answer is I don't know a good answer. Let's see. Akbar asks, what am I actually good at? It's kind of thing, starting from something complicated, drill down. Okay, oh yeah, okay. So this is a quote from me. Okay. All right, this is me talking about what I think I'm good at, which is starting from something complicated, drilling down to fundamentals, and then sort of doing the engineering to build it back up again. Yeah, I mean, gosh, most projects in my life have that general arc. I mean, building Wolfram language, computational language that I've been sort of building in one form or another for 45 years now, that was a story of what do you want to do computationally? Okay, let's find sort of an underlying framework for thinking about that, which ended up being symbolic expressions, transformations for symbolic expressions, symbolic language. That was kind of my sort of filtered set of primitives from which we've been building for the last 45 years, more than 45. How long is it? It's been, oh, it's about right. That's a sort of an example. I mean, another example is in kind of what I've tried to do with our physics project, sort of trying to understand what are the fundamental elements of the physical of physics and space and time and so on, and build up from that on a much smaller scale. Forget the whole universe. On a much smaller scale, sort of pretty much every project I end up doing, it's like kind of what's the point? What's the big, what's the core point? What is the essence of this? And how do you, I mean, even today we're working on some things to do with external compute services. And it's like, yeah, there's a big fuzzy picture, but what's the essential point? What is it going to turn into? For me, it often helps to say, what Wolfram language function will this end up being? What is the computational language representation of what I'm talking about? What is the sort of crisp primitive from which I can build that up? And then once you've got that idea, then you're like, well, okay, how do I build it up? How do I make a user interface? How do I do this? How do I write something that describes this, etc.? I mean, right now I'm in the middle of a project where I'm trying to understand sort of the foundations of medicine. And I don't mean kind of what sort of actual biological subsystems there are in humans or something. I'm trying to understand the question of, for example, one talks about diseases. What does that actually mean? Is there some kind of way of understanding, are there a discrete set of diseases, is it a continuous set of things? How does this work? And I found this very simple computational model for what's going on, which actually seems to have, so many features that are in common with what you actually see in kind of what has been mostly anecdotal ideas about medicine, and sort of under what circumstances, how do clinical trials work? How does, what happens with the outliers, so to speak? Anyway, I'm still in the middle of doing this, but it's been a good case where there's sort of a very complicated set of things that aren't really well formalized, often quite anecdotal. And can you get to the point where you have this crisp sort of set of primitives to formalize this and then build back up to something that one could sort of understand and relate to the things that have been thought about before. Let's see. Question here from Kian. What do you think about literature, fiction books? What are some of your favorite books? What would you recommend? Do you think it's important to read fiction? Well, this is one of my probably blind spots. I almost never read fiction. Really, really almost never. I know that I should. I feel like fiction is often a better way to communicate, particularly things about sort of the human condition and so on, and sort of than just, oh, here are some psychological facts about humans type thing. It's often a very efficient way to communicate those things. I mean, it's sort of interesting that back in the day, with Plato and Socrates and things, they were kind of writing up their philosophical work as kind of a faux discussion, so to speak. And that's which is, sort of semi-fictionalized, was going in that direction. But I think it's much easier when it comes to talking about sort of features of the human condition and the way we feel about things. That's probably often much better expressed in fiction than in sort of pseudoscientific fact, so to speak. I think I myself just, for whatever reason, my prioritization of time and so on is such that I basically never read fiction books. And I have to say, I'm occasionally I'm interested in kind of have people figured out in, for example, science fiction, ideas about, I don't know, alien intelligence or something like that. And I will do the terrible thing of trying to look at these books and trying to squeeze out sort of the abstract ideas, sort of removing all of the kind of the personal developments in these books, which is kind of a shame. I mean, I think my only kind of concession to these types of things is I do go and try and watch mainstream movies, although I have to say there have been very, very few of those in recent times, sadly. Maybe that's a type of thing that's sort of going extinct, unfortunately. But that's been a good way to ingest some amount of fiction and some amount of kind of seeing how the world sees itself type thing. But yeah, so I can't give good recommendations about fiction because I really don't read it, and I'm not saying that that's a proud feature. I'm saying that's a thing where if I had more time and if I didn't feel like I was kind of I didn't feel such a push to sort of do productive things all the time, I would probably do much more of that. It would be fun. I would enjoy it. I just have I kind of enjoy the results of producing things more than I do the ingestion of fiction and so on. So a bad answer, but it's the way it is. Yu asks, which do you think is easier, running a business or pursuing active scientific research? I've never found the pure sort of infrastructure of running a business particularly challenging. I mean, it is, things go well, they go less well, but there are decisions you have to make. Those have always seemed to me like they're mostly common sense. It's not like you're sitting there trying to figure it out and can you figure it out and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It can be hard work. It can be, you can have to, one feature of businesses is they inevitably involve other people, and there's a certain amount of sort of pushing that you have to do to get things to happen through other people. Sometimes I think, for science, when I'm doing it on my own, or maybe with one or two people helping me, but when I'm primarily doing it on my own, there's a certain kind of freedom that gives me, a certain ability to sort of a self-regulating thing where it's like, I'm working on this, I can go as fast as I want. It's not that I'm working on this thing, I'm trying to get something to happen from a business point of view, and I've got to convince 50 people to really, go in that direction type thing. And so in some ways that ends up being easier. I would say that in terms of there is more commonality than you might think between sort of business and science, in the sense that a lot of it is about deciding what to do. What is the strategy? What do you want to do? Then there's a mechanism of actually doing it. But there's the strategy part is actually surprisingly similar in my experience. Of, do you choose to do this? Do you choose to do that? Do you, given that you picked this path and things aren't working out that well, when do you sort of correct that and so on? The only difference for me, at least in business kinds of things, is you're usually dealing with, more people are involved on that path than there are on the science path. And so it's harder to make there's just a different set of, it's harder to make a mid-course correction. That's on the business side. On the science side, quite often it'll be like I'm doing things with my own fingers. I'm typing the code myself type thing. I'm writing the text myself. And there's a certain amount of just volumes of work that have to be done that that can be larger. Whereas if you're dealing with a company and it's like you have to set the strategy, but then there's a cast of thousands, so to speak, who can implement it. It's a different calculation, so to speak. But in terms of sort of the intellectual side of it, the strategy part is surprisingly similar in my experience. You've got this problem, and can you solve this problem? Can you figure out the problem? I would say the number one way to figure out the problem is to change the problem or to go around the problem rather than the sort of frontal assault of, how are we going to solve this? How are we going to solve this? I would say both in science and in business, that usually doesn't work that well. It's just like, how are we going to increase sales? Well, let's just increase sales. Let's invent a bigger quota. Let's, do this. That doesn't usually work. I mean, it's like you got to think about something which isn't just the frontal assault. It's got to be something where you're figuring out, well, I've got this different idea. Let's, go in this direction. And then that might come back to achieve that objective. And it's kind of the same thing in science when you've got something where it's like, I just can't figure this out. Why? I mean, I'm trying to think of something right now where, I'm thinking about some things to do with quantum mechanics, where it's like it has a certain flavor if you just can't figure it out, but that isn't how I feel about it at all. It's like I know what I have to do. I just have to understand more around the problem that I'm dealing with, rather than just like keep bashing on that one problem. It's just not, that's in my experience rarely the right way to solve things. Sahil asks about David Deutsch's Mathematicians Misconception. I've known David Deutsch for many, many years. I think he's even told me about his Mathematicians Misconception, but I don't remember what it is. So I can't help there. I'm trying to remember. We exchanged some mail about this, but I can't remember what it is. Sorry. Posty asks, are there any interesting things about version 14.2 that you can share? So we've been working hard on the next version of Wolfram Language, which will come out real soon now. I think a week or so. We've been working on it. Well, we always work on a kind of a portfolio of projects. We last released a version about 6 months ago. That's sort of our rhythm, but many projects that are going to be in version 14.2 were started much longer ago than that. Some of them 5 years ago, some of them 2 years ago, and so on. There's a lot of cool stuff in version 14.2. I'm not going to I probably won't be able to even come up with it. It's always one of the things that's complicated about doing building all these different versions is, for me, if somebody says, which version was that in? I usually can't remember. It's like, because I've been running version 14.2 for 5 months. So in different stages of development. So it's kind of hard for me to remember what's there, what's in 14.1, what's in 14.3, what's, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there's some cool stuff, particularly handling large data and other things. I think I will say that the process of designing these new versions is very open. So you could probably know more than I can know about what's in it by watching the live streams or the archives of the live streams that we've done of design reviews for version 14.2. You'll find a lot about this thing called tabular, which is a way of handling large data. That's really very nice. And there's probably, oh gosh, I have no idea. There's many, many tens of hours of live streams of design reviews about tabular that paint a pretty clear picture of that. Anyway, I still have to finish writing my description of 14.2 that hopefully will go out real soon. Let's see. IQ is asking, how would you approach teaching math? Well, I've tried to do a few little efforts along those lines. I think both this year and, this in 2024 and in 2023, somebody designated a particular day, Math Storytelling Day. And so I tried to talk about, first I did algebra, and I think I got to calculus by the next year, so to speak, in a sort of one session type thing. that was sort of my attempt at a quick kind of conceptual view of math. I what can I say about teaching math? I think that there are many different reasons to teach math. I mean, one is that it's a field where there are definite things to say. And you could teach other areas and it's all kind of a vague feeling and everybody can debate everything. But in math, there really are definite right answers. Same is true in computation. You write a program, it does what it's supposed to do, or it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. It's not, well, I can argue that it does it or something. It's a thing where there's a certain degree of sort of precision of thinking that you get to learn. And I think that's one of the important things that you learn in doing math is sort of an organized precision of thinking, an organized way of thinking about things. Sometimes it goes a bit overboard. And it's kind of like, oh, yes, the humans should learn how to do this very organized thinking, which is done by computers in a millisecond or microsecond even sometimes. And the humans, it's really difficult to do it. And, do you really learn how to do all those things? I think some amount of that is probably worthwhile as a way to kind of learn how to do things in a structured fashion where there's a definite right answer. Although I would argue that, writing programs in computational language is probably it might be an even better way to achieve that same objective. Another thing about math is an important historical sort of cultural piece of intellectual history. And a lot has been discovered in math that is kind of, it's part of our culture. What is I don't know, something about, I don't know, the idea of real numbers, the idea of even the idea of rational numbers, the idea of things about geometry and regular polyhedra, things like this. These are pieces of our sort of shared intellectual heritage, and they're worth knowing about, just as it's worth knowing a certain amount about history and so on. They're part of and a certain amount about sort of cultural history and literature and so on. They're part of what allow us, what we've achieved as a species, but also they're part of what you need if you're going to, if we all know the same things, we all know the same words, we all know the same whatever, it's part of what sort of binds together sort of our society is that we're able to talk about things where we all understand what we're talking about. And I would say that math, as sort of versions of math, have seeped into a lot more of kind of everyday life than they had in the past. I mean, I would say even when I was a kid, the amount of sort of mathy stuff that you would be sort of exposed to in everyday life was much smaller. I mean, it was, even things like, what percentage complete? What percentage of what percentage complete? What is the fragmentation on your disk and how much, extra memory could you use? And all these things, everything has become much more numerical, much more places where sort of math can matter. I mean, the average rating was this, the median rating was that. Why are they different? There's more of these things that are sort of a part of what you need to know to sort of exist in the modern world. I would say that sort of mathematical thinking of sort of how do you do things in an organized way, that's a really good thing to learn. I mean, I think one simple example I came up with ages ago when somebody was asking me about this was, you got a cube, and you're going to label the corners of the cube. How do you do it? So you might just say, well, I got this cube. I could pick it up, I turn it around, I thought that one's 1, that one's 2. You're sort of doing it randomly. But in fact, there's ways to think much more systematically about how do you do it. What are you could give it coordinates. You could combine those coordinates. You could take, ones and zeros. You can convert them from binary. You could make a path going around the cube. There are sort of ordered ways to do that. And thinking through sort of how do you make things organized like that is a kind of skill that happens in math. And that's, I think, useful. I would say there are other pieces of sort of what's taught in math, particularly when you go to sort of higher levels in pure mathematics, like the teaching of doing proofs and so on, which I don't know. Again, it's one of these things where it's learning a particular mode of thinking, and it's an interesting mode of thinking. It's not applicable everywhere, It's applicable pretty much to math and a few things around math, protocols for cryptography or something like that, but it's not the thing where, I have to say I've seen a few times in my life people who've been pure mathematicians for a long time, and then they're exposed to everyday things in the world, let's say in business, and they're like, how can we prove this about some business? Well, it just doesn't work that way. The epsilon delta proof for the profit of a business will never work. It's something where, it's a way of thinking in math that's very precise. You get the right answer, so to speak, within the domain that you've set up. But when it comes to something like business, it's really a different kind of thing. There's a way of thinking about that too, that has its own kind of intellectual rigor, but it's very different from the way of thinking about math and doing proofs. Let's see. Posty asks, would you like better creative meetings or more technical language design meetings? And then the extra question, what live stream series is your favorite? I like a mixture of things. I suppose I would set up my life to kind of emphasize the things that I like to do most, but I have to say what ultimately I like most is a mixture of things. So, I could spend 6 hours doing creative stuff, but I don't think I could quite spend, maybe I've done this a few times. If I spend 14 hours doing creative stuff, 16 hours doing creative stuff, I think that I kind of start to be less efficient and kind of wilt at that point. But if I'm doing a bit of that, a bit of kind of more procedural kinds of things, kind of making judgment calls, those sorts of things, if I'm mixing those together, that gives me that's a really good thing. I think so. It's a bit of each. In terms of live streams, I don't know. I've tried a bunch of different things. Many of you may know for a number of years, I've been doing these Q&A live streams. I find these fun. You guys ask me all kinds of questions that make me think about things that I either haven't thought about before or think about things I have thought about in a different way. I find these interesting. Hopefully other people find them interesting too, but I must admit that at some level, it's a matter of sort of self-discovery as much as anything that I find worthwhile, and I will typically I'll be in a good mood, so to speak, as a result of doing these live streams and coming into them. It's kind of like an immediate, I like to do this. One thing I noticed about myself, this is a terrible thing to admit, but I have a terrible habit of unconsciously whistling while I work. And one of the things I really should make a more scientific study of this. There's certain projects that I do and things that I do obviously on my own where I start doing them and the whistling starts up. And that's probably a sign this is something I actually really want to do. And it happens a lot with creative kinds of things, I've noticed, even though it's sort of an unconscious thing I can sort of notice if I think about it that I'm doing that. It's probably terribly tuneless and I would be embarrassed to even try to record it. But it's sort of a sign, I suppose, of things that I like to do. In terms of these live streams, I've had, well, there are ones that I do that are part of my sort of day job of design reviews. We haven't done as many live streamed science sessions as we had done in past years, partly because a lot of that work is being done outside of normal hours, and the infrastructure of doing live streaming is a bit more difficult to set up. And I probably should do more of that. I think I've done a certain number of interview live streams where I talk to people. Those are a lot of work because I feel like I have to prepare, and then it's just they're much better if I spend some time preparing them, and just they've ended up being a lot of work, and sometimes also it's a little bit more intense for me because it's kind of like not only am I thinking about questions and so on and trying to learn things myself, but I'm also thinking about, how do we deal with whatever comes up with sort of the person and the live stream, and it's just all a bit more complicated. In terms of, I have to say we started off with just science and technology Q&A for kids and others, which I started at the beginning of the pandemic as sort of a piece of public service, but then discovered it was fun and interesting and people seemed to like it. Then we kind of have added these different live streams, including this one, Business Innovation and Managing Life. I added, a couple of years ago now. This has been fun. One that we added more recently was Future of Science and Technology, in addition to History of Science and Technology. That's been fun. I'm thinking of adding more live streams where I'm actually trying to figure things out in real time using our computational language and things like this. Those are, when I get into them, those are fun to do, but they feel like a lot more work. They feel like more kind of, it's just, I really have to be paying attention. Otherwise, I'm having people just watch me do some stupid piece of debugging, which isn't much fun. I mean, watching a certain amount of debugging is interesting and quite useful, but watching, oh, I got stuck in this rabbit hole because I didn't notice some silly thing and I'm stuck there for 10 minutes. It's kind of like, it's more, I feel an obligation not to waste people's time like that. And so that makes it a little bit more intense for me. Let's see. Yeah, Cosmic comments. Audiobooks allow me to read every book I've ever wanted multiple times, including lots of fiction. My problem with that is that I don't end up with terribly much downtime because even when I like to go for a walk every day for an hour and a half, 2 hours, but I'm doing meetings and talking to people and looking at a screen and so on. I think the it's so I don't end up. It's actually pretty rare that I end up with oh, I don't have anybody I need to talk to. I don't have anything. And I just have a chance to purely consume, so to speak, rather than also being a producer of things. Gosh, lots of questions here. II is commenting, music is great for one's mind, including whistling and singing. Yeah, well, I have to say, in past years, I would sometimes listen to music when I was working on certain kinds of things, particularly when I was grinding through thousands of emails and I felt like I needed something to keep me more enthusiastic, so to speak. But I found that every time I would actually get to a piece of email that I really had to think hard about how to respond, I would pause the music. And I realized that I really can't multitask that way. I already had discovered much earlier than that music with vocals was hopeless. And I would start kind of typing fragments of what I was hearing, so to speak. I tried foreign language where I don't know the language at all. That worked better. But without vocals was even better. But I found it's kind of almost a crutch for me if I'm trying to work. It's like really I'm not paying enough attention. And I know that I'm not a good multitasker in that regard, so I tend to avoid it. Let's see. LB asks, am I more watch the movie adaptation or read the book? As I say, I'm just really bad at reading fiction books, really bad. So I'm a watch the movie kind of person. Let's see. Unusual question here from James asking, would I be willing to talk a little bit about Jonathan Gorard and his work? Well, Jonathan is I owe a lot to Jonathan because he's one of the two young physicists who kind of got me restarted on our big physics project back in 2019. And I'm a big fan. It's we've done a fair amount of work together, not so much very recently, but bright young physicist with lots of potential, and I've definitely enjoyed the interaction with him. I think he's one of these people who tends to go sort of ebbs and flows on different kinds of topics. So I think the things I'm sort of, as I in this year 2025, hopefully lots of cool things with Jonathan. We'll see. But it's a funny question. But I'm enough of a fan of Jonathan that I'm happy to make that comment, so to speak. Let's see. Nari asks, how would you think about creating a fact-checking apparatus for the future of information media? Oh boy, what a can of worms. What's a fact? You know, that's the first question. In building Wolfram Alpha, for example, we have concentrated a lot on things which are sort of a facty enough. What does that mean? Somebody says, what's the population of country X? Okay, well, do we really know? No, we don't really know. You know, I know from working with folks like UN agencies that deal with these kinds of things, that it's very funny how many countries have, what is the number? I think it's like just over 5 million people, you know, 5,000,001 type people, because, you know, you get some special feature if you're that size. That number might be wrong, but and then there are countries where it's like, well, we've got lots of people in the country, but we only have this number of citizens, and that's all we're counting. And you know, and then, well, then you don't have the population of the country. Well, but what do you mean by the population of the country? It's you know, is it the number of people who are hanging out within the borders of the country, or is it the number of people that are, you know, getting benefits from the government or something, or you know, how does that actually work? And so, but you know, when you're saying what's that fact, well, there are sort of official censuses from countries saying there are this number of people in the country, and it's that's a thing where in building Wolfram Alpha, for example, we've taken the point of view, if there's a thing where there's a definite entity that sort of one believes in that says the number is X, we'll say the number is X. Now, you know, it could be the case that somebody squiggled that number, but at least we're reporting that's the number that the official agency says is the number, and that's what you can base things on. I have to tell a story, but back many years ago now, when Wolfram Alpha was younger, and we were just, you know, trying queries just for fun. One of the queries somebody tried was, how many turkeys are there in Turkey? Okay, and you plot the curve, and it's very smooth, except one year there's a glitch. And I was like, let's find out what that glitch is. Just a good example of data and, you know, and how you actually find out what is really true. So it's like, okay, where do we get that data from? We got it from the Food and Agriculture Organization. Okay, we asked them about this data. They say, yeah, that kind of looks wrong, but we don't really know. We got that data from the Turkish Statistical Organization. Okay, so then we contact the Turkish Statistical Organization. Eventually we get to the person who is responsible for the Turkey census in Turkey, et cetera. And they say, well, yes, there's an official government mandated census that has to be done for this or that reason. And there are these, you know, books of, you know, bound books or something of you know, the results of that census. Let me go look for you for that one. Person comes back and says, well, that book is missing. Okay, where do we go from here? You know, we can't recount the number of turkeys that there were in Turkey in whatever year it was. So that fact is just kind of missing. And we have something that was reported that's presumably wrong for whatever reason, but it's, you know, that's what we can do. That's as facty as we can get, so to speak, is that's what the Food and Agriculture Organization registered as the number of turkeys in Turkey in that year. Now, obviously things get, you know, much funkier than that. I mean, when you ask, you know, if you say, is so-and-so a good person? Well, you know, that's not in the type of thing that would be a fact. You could ask a question like, I mean, there are many things that degenerate into non-facts. I mean, you know, when it comes to things which are, let's say, legal cases, you can say, well, the judge ruled X, Y, and Z. The judge might have been wrong, but nevertheless, it's a fact. In some sense, it's a well-documented fact that the judge ruled X, Y, and Z. Who was the best actress in such and such a year? Who knows? But somebody won the Oscar for best actress or whatever, and that's something much more sort of attachedly factual. So, I think the people have used our technology, tried to use our technology a lot for various kinds of fact checking. I think it's a complicated story because there are things which you can attach to sort of well anchored sort of sources of facts. And certainly in Wolfram Alpha, we've made a big effort, and I think we've been very successful actually at this, at really, having things which are sort of are kind of well anchored, computable facts, and where where certainly we didn't cheat the facts, so to speak. I mean, the number of turkeys in Turkey for that year might be wrong, but it's not wrong because we cheated it, so to speak. And I will say that at times we've been, because we are, for better or worse, the main source of kind of factual oracle data for things like blockchains. We feel sort of an obligation to make sure that we don't get it wrong, because sometimes there'll be a chain of sort of, in effect, bets that have been made based on the way some fact comes out. And, that will be triggered by something that we report, so to speak. So we'd like to get it right. There hasn't been really quite enough kind of money on the line effectively to make one really, really concerned about this up to this point. But I have been interested in the question of what would we do? What do we do to make, we have our fact source, how do we make it as good as possible? And what I've concluded is there really isn't a way to say we're always going to get it right. It's just, that's a hopeless proposition. What we can say is we might get it wrong, but we won't be crooked. We won't, there'll be nothing kind of, we're not squiggling. We're not putting our finger on the scale. We might just get it wrong. I mean, the typical quintessential case is, there's an election in some country and there's some process for resolving it. And people are like arguing for weeks or whatever, or even, the scenario that can happen is the election was supposedly decided by the processes that were going on, but the presidential palace is encircled by tanks, and it's unlikely that whoever thought they were in charge is really in charge, type thing. And so what do you do under those circumstances? Well, you have to have a criterion. Well, if it was in that country, the criterion for the election is blah, 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 even though in practice, that might not be the description of who's running the country, type thing. And I think so there's a question of practical point of view, what do you do? And my plan has been, which we haven't implemented in its full form, is more or less this. You have a certain pool of data curators, a few hundred people, let's say, maybe a little bit more, who are kind of on call. And then if there is a contested fact or something that's a complicated thing that comes in where you don't really know whether to call it this way or that way, you basically call in the data curators. Let me give you an example of facts that something comes in. One of the grimmer features of the Wolfram Alpha story is the obituary feed of, because we list information about people. If somebody dies, we'd like to be able to record that fact. But, you get reports of things from newspapers, whatever else, the web, X, whatever it is. And sometimes it's like kind of obvious, this is for real type thing. But occasionally there'll be a like, what do we do? It's not clear. The rumors have, it's said that so-and-so, such and such, but actually we're not sure type thing. What do you do? And that's a case where you kind of have to escalate that. But this procedure I'm kind of describing, you start with a few hundred data curators, and then when some contested thing comes in, it's like, okay, let's pick 5 of them at random. And, hopefully it's the right time of day for those people, whatever else. You say, okay, you're going to be on sort of a more or less proctored 15 minutes. where your goal is, just like when online exam taking or whatever, everything's being recorded, and you just go in and it's like, okay, you figure out, what do you think about this fact? Is it this way or is it that way? And you're by picking people at random, you're kind of removing certain kinds of bias about facts, hopefully. And hopefully, if you have a big enough pool of people, or a well enough selected pool of people, and then you're kind of, by kind of proctoring the thing, you're kind of, what happened, and if you've got 5 people looking at this and 4 of them say, yeah, it goes this way, you probably just say, okay, fine, that's the way it's going to go. And the point there is to be able to say, look, it wasn't like something squiggly happened where somebody called them and said, hey, I've got a $10 million bet on this thing. Can you throw it the other way? We know that didn't happen in that case. And so we've got something where we can be confident, even if we get it wrong in the end, because all the data said this happened, but in fact it didn't happen. At least, what we did wasn't something that was, where there was some nefarious, corrupt thing going on. So that's sort of my best effort there. But it's a very complicated issue, and it's something where, people will say, I mean, it always amuses me that people will say, particularly in modern times, where it seems like sort of almost everything that gets said is somehow well, not everything, but a certain set of things get sort of entangled with a political point of view or this point of view or whatever else. And it's like somebody says, it's a fact that whatever. And somebody else will say, no, the exact opposite is true. And, they'll both have partial arguments for what's going on. But really, the only way you could know is, for somebody like me, I'm occasionally actually interested in what's actually true, and I will go and do my best to find the raw data and figure out what's true. And it's usually somewhere a bit in between what the extreme kind of people with various agendas had to say about those things. Sometimes it's not between. Sometimes it's just one's right and the other's wrong, but more often it's between. Let's see. I need to get going in a moment here, but yeah, I see a vote for a live stream with Jonathan Gorard. Yeah, we should do that. It's just one of those get it to happen, get people's schedules to mesh, and so on. They're fun. I have fun, at least. I think there's a certain rate of information exchange that can be quite high, which is great, but may not be such a good spectator sport. Let's see. Some other very interesting questions here, but let's see. One more here. Well, okay, I'll try this. Upcycle is asking, what do you think about AI's role in mathematical proofs in 2025? Well, I just wrote something related to that, about a long proof that I did 25 years ago about the simplest axiom for Boolean algebra for logic, and where the proof generated by automated theorem proving is really long, really complicated, and really incomprehensible to humans. And I was kind of really exploring that proof and trying to ask what it would take to make it understandable, and also kind of what would we expect from an AI, so to speak. When it comes to putting together the pieces for a proof like the one I was doing there, it's not really, current neural net AI is not particularly useful, so far as I can tell. I mean, there's some technical areas in which it's a question of, when you're sort of finding these paths in this kind of mathematical proof space, there's this question of, should you take that path or the other path? And there's to a certain extent, one can kind of maybe AIs could be helpful, but I don't think so, because I think they're most helpful when there's kind of human-like things going on, and where kind of it's a kind of uh, it's it's where sort of there's a lot of text and it's kind of like, oh, there's a general feeling of this and general feeling of that. This is a much more austere situation where you've got just a big bag of symbols and it's like, should it be A dot B dot C dot A or should it be C dot B dot whatever? And that's not something where there's sort of this kind of human engagement type thing, which I think is what the LLMs particularly do well at, of kind of extrapolating from, the humans said this, that sort of fits in with another thing that humans might say. These kind of very austere kind of computational mathematical things are less suitable for that. Now, what one might hope is that LLMs could be good at kind of saying, okay, I can do a sort of essentially a literature search. And I could say, this thing you're trying to figure out here, so-and-so in 1972 figured out this other related thing. You can glue their result in and make progress here. I think that's another direction. Another direction people are trying to go in is to be able to take a math paper and kind of formalize it. I don't know how well that's going to go. I think it's a lot of work, and I'm not sure that what you get at the end of it is worth having, because what you get at the end of it, the limit of that is what happened with this automated theorem proving proof, where the result is true, but it's just a complicated mess of incomprehensible kind of sort of incomprehensible, computationally irreducible steps. I mean, I think when you talk about proofs, one of the main things that's a value in a proof is it's kind of this way of explaining a mathematical idea. But when that proof is kind of this machine code level proof that is guaranteed correct, because every step followed from every step, but it's very non-human, that doesn't really serve the purpose of being expository, which is what a lot of proofs want to be. And another thing about proofs, the most powerful proofs are ones that bring in a really new concept, where you thought you were proving something about, I don't know, the solutions to a cubic equation, and you thought it was all about real numbers, but actually then complex numbers appeared, and then you have this whole structure from complex numbers, which is interesting in its own right. The proofs as a forcer of kind of coming up with new concepts. Will the AIs be able to do that? At some level, I'm a little concerned that they'll do it too well, and that then they'll be just spewing out concepts, and we humans are just kind of like, we throw up our hands. I mean, like this proof that I got 25 years ago of this simplest axiom system for Boolean algebra, you could think of the lemmas inside that proof as throwing up lots of concepts, but there's so many that you just drown. I mean, maybe if there was just one, and I tried to find that in this piece that I recently wrote, what are the most popular ones? What can we do with these most popular ones? Okay, it's a lemma. It says that A dot A dot A dot A equals A or something like this. But then where do we go from that? Well, where we want to go is, that's connected to the idea of idempotence for operators that aren't associative and this and that and the other. And there's a story, so to speak, mostly told with words. But it's not clear if you're generating things automatically like that, you often will sort of go out into the computational universe to things which are very far away from where we humans have yet kind of reached. And it's kind of a story of a lot of what I've studied in computer experiments, in ruleology, the study of programs with simple rules and so on, how that works. You're often going out into the kind of the wilds of the computational universe, finding all kinds of things where you look at it and you say, hey, that's pretty interesting. And then not but there isn't really a human story to tell. I mean, this is a thing that I think is written about quite a bit recently in biological evolution, in machine learning. There's a lot of kind of mining this computational universe, getting these lumps of irreducible computation, which achieve a purpose that's useful, but which are deeply non-human in the way that they work. And where it's not clear to me where we go from that and what that means for mathematical proofs, beyond simply saying, okay, we know that that thing is true. Let's say we have a proof of the Riemann hypothesis, but it's incomprehensible. Well, it's still kind of useful. I mean, in a sense, we've already used that. Even though we don't have a proof, there are plenty of things in mathematics where people say, assuming the Riemann hypothesis, blah, blah, blah. And by the way, maybe it will be the case that the reunion hypothesis isn't even provable from the existing axioms that we have, and it'll be like the continuum hypothesis, where you can just pick it as this way or that way because it's independent of the axioms that have already been defined, and that becomes sort of a complicated story in kind of the how should one think about mathematics? What is one putting in versus what is one getting out? This is a long topic, and maybe I shouldn't get too deeply into this right now, but and more of a topic for the science side of things. I think this is I'm not sure that it probably doesn't fall quite in the rubric of these particular live streams. All right, I think I need to run, but thanks for joining me today, and thanks for lots of interesting questions. I always learn a lot. I hope it's been interesting to you folk too. Well, so until the next time, bye for now.